And Cornell has been the associate member of Osage for the past number of years. They have provided tremendous support in our process of helping startup companies and helping their investment and their growth. So, and today's topic I felt is particularly useful, as you all know, or may have heard, that the teams are among the most important, if not the most important thing, people look at it. And in terms of these, the founders' equity and CEO questions is among the most frequently discussed topics for people. And it's extremely important for the early stage team. So I hope today's discussion will, be very providing you useful information, and you can use that in the real world scenario someday in the near future. So with that said, I'm going to turn this to Kirsten and Margalit. All right. And also one more thing, and today we want this to be a very interactive session. So it's not, as you can see, it's not in the sort of a seminar thing, you can only see the speaker. So it's in a Zoom format. People can easily raise their hand and ask questions. But Kirsten, they will manage that process, when you have questions, how that will be, but it will be a very interactive session. All right. And thanks. Okay, Kirsten and Margalit.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice. And thanks for having us here today to talk with everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that people, because we do have a slide deck that we're going to run through, but I would like to reiterate what Alice said, that we would really like this to be very interactive. We want to answer your questions if we have answers. We may not always have answers for you. And so please do use the reaction button to raise your hand. Hopefully we can see that, but Linda, for some reason, we can't just alert us if we're missing anything. Or go ahead and also ask questions in the chat box. One of us will be checking the chat box when the other isn't talking. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and I apologize, this is not yet in presentation format. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, can you guys, do you see the right screen, the correct screen for you to see? Okay, great. I always love it when it actually works. So yeah, so as Alice said, we're going to be talking today about founders' equity, as well as assessing potentially, and we know that probably many of you are scientific founders, assessing potentially your CEO for your startup company. And run through some options on that. So Margalit, do you want to introduce yourself?
Definitely. I'm an associate on the life science investment team at Osage University Partners, OUP. My background is I have a PhD in neurobiology, spent some time at the bench doing preclinical, clinical work, potential therapeutics, prognostic biomarkers, and some neuroimaging as well. Prior to OUP, I was a postdoc at Penn. While I was a postdoc and shortly after, I spent a little bit of time in life science startup and biotech community in Philadelphia, and then made my way over to OUP just over a year and a half ago, September 2019.
It's been terrific having you with us, Margalit. She's been a terrific addition to our team. And you'll hear a lot about her commentary and what she's been coming across in the startup world today. I'm Kirsten Leute. I'm a partner and on our university relations side here. We partner with academic institutions in order to invest in startups at OUP. So we're partnered with about 100 academic institutions right now, including Cornell University. Very proud about that. I previously worked in tech transfer as well. So I have known Alice for a couple of decades, I think, Alice. We don't want to talk about probably how long. And I previously worked at Stanford's tech transfer office, and also for a year in Germany in tech transfer as well. And then have worked in the field for a long time. But I do want to mention that OUP, we invest across deep science that's coming out of university. So we invest both on the life sciences side. So Margalit is on our life sciences team, as well as the tech side. So basically anything physical sciences we invest in. So we have two teams that work in those areas. Although these days they're working on a lot of crossover stuff, since people are working together jointly to solve many problems on both sides. And we do invest anywhere from seed stage to pre-IPO. So we're looking at startups kind of at many facets of their journeys. So if we don't already know about your startup, feel free to reach out to us. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into founders' equity. And we get a lot of, the reason that we created this talk is because we get a lot of questions from people about how founders' equity should work and why it should work the ways that it perhaps does. And so we start off with the basic question is that why does equity exist in companies, and what's the purpose or what we see as the purpose of it, and why do you give equity to your employees and your founders? And what you're trying to do is reward past performance. So reward the performance that is actually making the company what it is. And then you're also trying to incentivize future performance. So we're going to talk a lot about how you actually make that incentivization work. You don't necessarily give all that equity right away, right? You give it over time, and you're rewarding the performance and the company meeting the milestones. So we have here the Sagrada Familia, so that people, as an example where, this has been going on for a very long time, but a lot of this has actually, the building of this amazing structure has been in the last several years because people were being rewarded for doing so. And so we're going to talk about that throughout this founders equity split part. So we have an example here of something that we see that is perhaps pretty common with initial just founders split. So people come together, they say, hey, we're going to start a company. We're going to found it around a technology that the scientists created. And so the founders split is often something like 40-40-20, 40% to the CEO, perhaps, and the lead founders, because they're the people who are taking this out, doing full time, taking this venture forward. 40% then also maybe to the co-founders and key employees, C-level executives, et cetera, that are helping this along. And then you always have to have an option pool. An option pool is there to incentivize your employees. And so from day one, you want to incentivize them to join your company, and then for them to start vesting in their options. So you're not going to give it to them all right away, but they're going to get something over time as they contribute to the company, stay with the company for a certain amount of time. And then you're going to keep refreshing this option pool as you raise more money. Is there anything you wanted to add there, Margalit?
Oh, no, that was good.
Great. All right. So next up is putting bounds on founders' equity. So one of the things that we, because we have a lot of data of working with startup companies, and I will tell you, this is data that we're actually hoping to refresh this coming year. We looked at on the tech side. So this data is particularly for tech. We looked at about 20 portfolio companies of ours, and we looked at how they split those initial founders' equity. And so on the graph here on the right, you can see how this was split between different companies. And so, for example, the founding CEO, so this is the number of founders associated with the company over here. You can see the blue through the teal colors, number of founders, and then how the initial equity was split in these particular companies. So the founding CEO amongst these companies, it was anywhere from 15 to 90%. So quite a big range, but really going to be in this, about 20 to 60% range. But if you really start going into the data, probably 25 to 50% going to that founding CEO. Initial founder PEI, again, this all depends on the number of founders, again, how this is being split up. But going in probably in a slightly less range than that founder CEO, perhaps another founder PI, maybe a similar range, but perhaps isn't doing quite as much for the company, and moving on down there. And then we have something called the passive PI, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. But this is someone who isn't going to be doing major work with the company. They may have been involved with the science that was initially associated with the what is going into the startup company, but they likely aren't going to have a very active role with the company going forward. So they typically are going to be receiving less of that founding equity. So the things, again, we're trying to do here is you're rewarding for the past performance. So this is what these people are initially bringing to the table. This amount, again, they're not going to receive right away. It's going to vest over time. And then you're trying to, incentivize their future for performance. So that's part of the vesting over time. And every situation is different. This is not going to look the same. It's not always going to be this 40-40-20 split for each company. There are different parameters and what's going into and what you're trying to incentivize for future performance with each company. But we're trying to give you an idea, kind of the bounds, perhaps, of how this founder's equity split is going to work. Graduate students, and I know that Margalit can speak some to this as well, is incentivizing those graduate students, especially those who've worked on this and may actually be going to the company in the future as well. And so you want to think about how those founder equity shares perhaps are also associated with those graduate students who've worked on this and potentially will be working for the company in the future. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, just because we get a little bit more into these splits, since this is where we often get our questions. What's the right percentage for each one of these potential employees at the company? So that founding CEO, we're going to, guess around 30 to 60% initially. And again, this is just in this initial round of the company. An active founding scientist, maybe 20 to 25. That was kind of shown on the previous slide. A passive founding scientist, 1 to 5%. And again, diving a little bit deeper, because I know probably a lot of you are scientific founders. And active founding scientists are often part-time with the company, probably spending a good chunk of their time with the company. And active founding scientists are often more typical in tech companies than life science. I don't know if you've been seeing that as well, Margalit, but I know this is something that we're looking at more heavily for the life science side coming up too. And then the passive founding scientists, again, typically not spending very much time at all with the company beyond that kind of initial getting it off the ground. Universities typically receive some sort of equity for licensing the intellectual property to the startup company. We have a very wide range noted here. And the reason that there's a very wide range is because different universities have different practices and different roles that they often play with the companies with regards to that percentage. We're not trying to say that it's necessarily going to be at one end of the range or the other here, but your universities typically have their practices that work with that. Some universities, they're perhaps more interested in the equity than an upfront cash payment. Some universities, like the university I was at, we always asked for both. And other universities are trying to see, well, what are the different pieces that are applicable to this? And when that actually comes into play. So this is going to range a lot based on the university's practices and actually how much help they're giving to the company to get it off the ground. Later on in the company, there may be a professional CEO coming in. So you may have this founding CEO. When I worked at Stanford, we had a lot of people who would say, I'm going to be the CEO for years, maybe 1, 2, maybe 3, but then we're going to get a professional CEO coming in. My sweet spot is to help cut these companies off the ground, get the funding in, get the space, get the scientists associated with this, get us to our next steps as far as proof of concept. And then I'm done. We're going to bring in that professional CEO who knows more about getting this product out into the market, the different regulatory perhaps pathways that are associated with it, et cetera. So there's often people who feel like I'm a specialist being a CEO at this point. There are other CEOs who will run through the entire life cycle of the company. It really depends on their expertise, where they feel that they can learn and adjust perhaps what they've done before. But sometimes you're going to have a professional CEO coming in, and so that person is then going to get another split. And you'll see, these numbers after a while they add up to more than 100%. That's because, again, as you are raising more money, there's dilution that comes in, and the original people are getting diluted down. And we're going to talk more about dilution in a bit. And then here are just some other numbers, perhaps associated with different people who you're perhaps bringing into the company and how much they may be receiving off of that early equity associated with the company. And one of the reasons, and I'm just going to mention this right here, I think we may talk about this a little bit more. One of the reasons that you're looking at this initial equity amounts to associate with all of these positions is that when you're a startup and your salary base is X, and you're competing with Google or other large companies that are in the same space as you, or can take those engineers, perhaps their salaries may be much higher. And so you're incentivizing the employees with that potential upside for your company. All right, so Margalit, I think you're up now.
Yep. Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, so Kirsten did a really good job sort of walking through the types of, like, the difference between sort of a passive or an active scientific founder. But here we're just going to highlight a little bit more of the value that the academic founders, the PIs at the universities really bring to the company. And so in terms of founder participation at the startup, in tech, we see that some professors will be able to take 1 to 2 year sabbatical to get the startup up and running. And then once they're done with that, they return back to their faculty position. It's hard for the founder to stay up to speed with what's going on at the company once they're back at the university. So at that point, they become sort of more of a passive scientific founder. And then on the life science side, we typically see that a lot of the faculty members will stay at their university positions and maybe participate in the startup more on the scientific advisory board or in more of a passive role in that way. But the academic founders really do bring a lot of value to the startup, and that is something to be recognized. It's helpful for the startup to stay close to the founder for a number of different reasons, some that we list here on the slide. So essentially, the academic founders, they're the expert in their field, and they can provide invaluable thought leadership to the startup. A lot of fundraisers will have sponsored research agreements with the academic founder, so that they can continue working on maybe some super early stage programs that can develop technology that will later be licensed into the new startup. And their labs, as Kirsten mentioned before, can become great resources for future hires. So people who know the work well, that are working in the lab, can come to start at the startup, get off the ground really quick, and add a lot of value to the company. And so even though the scientific founder isn't always actively engaged in the day-to-day of the startup, they can provide additional value in other ways. Okay, go to the next slide. So with regards to the option pool that Kirsten mentioned before, this table sort of highlights how those options get granted out. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about refreshing the option pools as financing rounds go on and so on later. But when you hire someone new to the startup, you want to give them equity out of the option pool. As we mentioned, you're incentivizing for future performance. You can't provide very high salaries that can compete with the market for these people. You can't provide great benefits packages at new startups. They typically don't have those at all. And so the way to incentivize folks and the way to get great people to join the startup is to give them a little bit of equity, and that's going to come out of the option pool. When you have employees at the startup, when someone is promoted, you want to bring their equity allocation up to a level that it would be at for a new hire in that position. As we mentioned before, you want to reward past performance, but really incentivize for future performance, because the real work is going to come in going forward for the startup. So when someone's showing outstanding performance, you want to reward that, which should help incentivize them further. And then there's evergreen allocations from that option pool, which provides additional equity every year to help retain really good employees. Okay, go to the next slide. So why put so much attention into equity allocations, right? What's the downside of allocating your equity poorly? So we list some of the downsides to bad equity allocations here. In the previous slide, we highlight active versus passive founders. This is because of the pitfalls of having what's called a parasitic founder, which just sounds very negative, but it's for good reason. Sometimes you'll have founders that have a lot of equity, but aren't really involved in the day-to-day activities of the startups, aren't involved in the startup at all sometimes, don't even want to be contacted. I've had that happen with the startup that I was trying to work on at one point. And so you want to make sure that you're allocating equity to these to the scientific founders that are going to be involved and also going to be helping move the company forward in the future. Being an inventor on the patent deserves maybe a small portion of equity, but really pushing the company forward is what deserves a large chunk of equity. The other thing to keep in mind is the option pool. So which, as we pointed out, is important for incentivizing future performance. So remember, you have to refresh the option pool at every financing to make sure that there is enough to compensate new employees. Every time you refresh the option pool and add to it, you're diluting everyone on the cap table. So it's important to make sure that there is enough in the option pool for new employees going forward. And you want to give out shares from the option pool thoughtfully, but you also want to make sure you are giving enough to incentivize employees properly. The downside of not having enough in the option pool or not giving enough to certain employees is you can end up with unincentivized employees. And then the last point talks about this last resort option for companies that have poor equity allocation. So a recapitalization is when you issue just a ton of new shares in order to dilute everyone who's on the cap table. So you dilute everyone who has equity close down to zero in order to restructure the equity allocation and restructure the cap table. Everyone starts from scratch. It's really painful for everyone involved. And investors will sometimes choose to pass on a deal rather than clean up a cap table. So it's very important to be thoughtful about your equity allocation from the beginning. You can move on to the next slide. So you should think about your investors in the same way you think about new hires, and in the same way you think about like who's getting equity and who's on the cap table. Investors are going to be on your cap table with preferred shares, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later. So you want to make sure the investors you work with are adding value as well. Do they bring management to the team, like good management folks? Do they contribute to the culture in a positive way? Do they reserve funds for follow-on rounds and participate in those follow-on rounds? A bad investor could create bad culture on the board or participate in obstructive behavior, making it difficult to get things done, or they can even force a recap. So there are things you can look out for, though, that can help prevent or flag a potentially bad investor. There are terms in the term sheet to understand well, like the liquidation preferences. So what happens at the time you liquidate? Right of first refusal, so who gets to refuse a partnership or potential new deal, and voting thresholds, so who on the board can make or break a decision, who can align to make or break a decision. So understanding those dynamics is really important. And I think one of the more important discussions you can have with an investor in the beginning is to be aligned on your exit horizons. So it's a discussion you can have really early. Essentially, what does a potential exit look like for your startup, and how long will it take? Whether you're looking to go through an IPO and get your company public, or you're expecting an M&A and an acquisition down the line, or do you think that will happen 3 years from now or 10 years from now? That conversation should happen early, and you should be aligned in that regard with the investors you bring to the table.
And I was just going to mention, Margalit, this we talk about this in some other talks that we give, but I always like to mention is that when you're looking at your investors for your startup company, you should be doing a lot of diligence on them. They're doing a lot of diligence on you and your company and your employees, et cetera. You should be doing a lot of diligence on them. What are these investors bringing to the table for you? Are they going to be good people to work with? Or do they, as everyone always says, it's just not worth it in life to have people on your cap table that you're just not going to get along with. It's just, you're going to probably have, as Margalit mentioned, misaligned incentives, and therefore you really want to be understanding that you're striving for the same goal and you're going to be able to work together. But you're also going to be able to take constructive feedback from each other. So it's not necessarily that it's going to be, oh, we're going to be so nice to each other all the time. It is that I'm going to be able to listen to this person. They're going to be providing me they're going to provide advice. And I'm going to be able to perhaps make my choices of what I can do with that advice. But I need to be able to work with these people, and they're going to add some value in different ways. So,
yeah, those are very good points.
All right, so going on.
No worries.
Then.
Yeah, next slide.
The next slide.
So here we sort of just walk through like a typical fundraise and what happens to the equity dilution throughout from one series to the other. We're going to go into a lot more detail with regards to how this breaks down in the next section. But for now, what's important to understand is that, like, if you're raising funds, you're going to take some dilution with every round from an investor, and also by refreshing the option pool. The refreshing the option pool part is relatively small compared to the amount you will eventually give to investors. If you look at the first bar, we've outlined sort of a seed round. The investors here took 20% of the company, diluting everyone by 20%. And now the founders for this company own 30%. And other than the equity, another thing to pay attention to when you're looking at dilution is the valuation of the company. So how much is your company worth? This can be based on current revenue. However, in life science, there's frequently no revenue. So the company gets valued based on comparisons. Like, what would someone else pay for this company at its current stage in this particular clinical indication with this particular type of device or therapeutic? So here the investors ran the comps and found that the company that they were looking at was worth what says here the pre $4 million, right? And then they're putting in an additional 1 million of investment. So the company after the seed round is going to be worth $5 million. So when you get that to that Series A, notice the pre went up. So the company is now technically worth $10 million. So that $1 million of investment turned into $5 million worth of additional value. So at the end of the graph, notice the company founder is now diluted down to 12% after the Series C. Let's say the exit after the C for the average exit value we list here, it's like 240 million. So that founder made 28 to 29 million off of that exit. Compare that to if he didn't raise additional capital, sold after the seed, he would have had 30% of a $10 million company. So that's $3 million compared to that 29 after all that dilution. So even though the founder's equity stake is decreasing, the amount of value being created in the company makes that dilution a worthwhile trade-off. Go to the next slide.
Actually, we have a couple. Let's do the next slide, but we have a few questions too. But I think you're going right.
Yeah. I'll just finish this up and then we'll take questions because this is the last slide in this section. So essentially, what we're trying to highlight is that every time you are considering dilution from a VC or an investor, you should think about the valuation of the company, what that exit looks like, what dilution can I take to create more value? The idea being that you would rather have a small piece of a big pie as opposed to a large piece of a small pie. And now, so we'll go to
the questions. So one was actually on this last slide, we didn't divide out the split between founding CEO and academic PI. Yeah, we could do that. And again, if you go back to our initial ones, you could probably calculate it out from there, but we're always happy to follow up with you on that if you have particular questions on that. But some of the questions actually were about are the statistics in these slides weighted to tech investments? I mentioned at this talk, or is this also true for bio? I know this particular slide was based on tech. This was an example across, we said the average successful startup raises $41 million across 4 rounds and exits at 240. That is a tech investment based number. And like I said earlier, we plan to create the same things on the life sciences side. These ones just happen to be tech for this. So this particular slide is tech. And I can't remember the other slide the other one where we showed the engineering, et cetera, that was definitely a tech one as well. We hope to create a life science one in the future for that too. But maybe you could talk a little bit, Margalit, going back to perhaps this slide, do you see, this one, do you see much difference as far as the founding CEO, active founding scientists, path as founding scientists, as far as on the life science side?
For that section, not as much. No, I think that's pretty, I think that's pretty representative of also life science. Where it breaks down is just, I guess in terms of how passive the scientist is. I feel like a lot of tech science PIs are sometimes a lot more involved than some of the life science PIs, and it's not a negative. That is just to say the complexity of taking a therapeutic or a device forward, and once it's been initially created, is a lot different than for some of the tech startups that are going forward. It's just drug development is a very different type of skill set than drug discovery. And at that point, once you're starting the startup, it's really more drug development as opposed to just looking at the mechanism of action, the biology, and the targets. So it's just a very different skill set.
Right.
Yeah.
And then another question was, and we're getting some fun comments in here, is how do you diligence? How should people diligence their investors?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So hopefully you'll have multiple conversations with your investors. You're going to get to know at least one person at the fund very well, who's going to be contacting you a lot and asking you a lot of questions. Take advantage of those discussions. Ask them about about the fund. Ask about how long the fund's been around, what year it's in. I feel like that's a really important question that gets overlooked. Like when did they start investing out of it, and when are they going to look to realize the fund? Make sure that matches up with your exit horizons as well. Ask them questions about what value they bring. Do they do a lot of company formation? Do they have a network of management that they can bring to your company? Like if you're looking for a CMO, do they have a few folks that they could recommend? I would look at their portfolio too. What other investments have they done? Have they done a lot of investments in the space that you're in? And so do they bring that type of expertise to the table? And how successful have their investments been? You could assess that. I mean, not every investment needs to be successful, and they won't. We actually do the math because we know that a lot of things will fail. And that's just the way that venture investments work. But do they have some successful investments in there, and how successful were they? I would definitely pay attention to that. How long did it take to realize some of those? You can look at that. I would definitely Google a lot. We're going to go into a CEO assessment later, and there's a whole list of things that we recommend for diligencing a CEO. You could do all of that for your investor as well.
I definitely recommend talking to people who've worked with that investor, and how it's worked for them. And some of your investors, are going to play different roles typically with your company. You're going to have lead investors who are probably going to be the much more active, board members, et cetera. You're also going to have co-investors who are going to bring other things to the table, including what Margalit was mentioned before, is you want to look at these investors as long-term investors. They're not just investing you for this one round and thinking, okay, you're going to exit after this. You're thinking, okay, these are investors who, provided we actually accomplish the things that we say we're going to for this round, or at least a portion of those, these are investors hopefully will be investing in our coming rounds. They're going to help us in different ways, but financially, hopefully they are going to have enough capital left. And again, that's understanding that about your investors, how much capital they're going to have left to invest in your future rounds as well. So we have a couple of other questions. As against the founding CEO's KPIs, how do you typically define future contributions of the founding scientists, even though he would not be naturally incentivized because they've already, there are multiple ways that they're being incentivized already through the founder's equity, perhaps through the licensing arrangement with the university, et cetera. So how do you define the future contributions of those founding scientists?
Yeah, that it's definitely hard. How do you predict what somebody's going to do going 2 years from now, right? You can't. All you can do is basically judge them on the commitment they're showing you and the commitment they're agreeing to. So from my own personal experience, trying to get a couple life science startups off the ground, I was working on two. One was a diagnostic and one was a therapeutic. For the therapeutic company, when I was diligencing the tech to figure out what the next steps needed to be in terms of what the startup would need to take on for additional preclinical studies, I was reaching out to this particular PI and frequently not getting responses. And they were very honest with me in saying that they are not interested in being on the commercial end, and they're not interested in being a part of the startup. So based on those conversations and the fact that they were even just difficult to get in touch with initially, I realized this is going to be a very passive PI whose name is essentially going to be on the cap table with very minimal equity, but is probably not going to contribute much going forward. As opposed to the other startup that I was working on, where every time I sent an email, I got a response. I was on multiple calls with the PI. They were willing to help us with the licensing and connecting us to tech transfer offices. They were very responsive. That person in particular wasn't necessarily taking on a like active role in the startup. They weren't going to be like a CSO or like some senior research scientist or anything like that, but they were at least engaged. So I knew that going forward, the likelihood is they will continue to be engaged. They were very committed to getting this commercialized. They were very committed to aiding in it getting to market. And so that's how I would judge future contributions, based on just our interactions with that person. Before you give out any equity, just have multiple conversations. Is there anything you'd add, Kirsten?
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really good. I having been associated with academic startups now for over 25 years, the roles vary so greatly with regards to the scientific founders. And by scientific founders, I'm talking about both perhaps the PI and the graduate researchers and the postdocs and all of those who worked on this. So it just varies quite a bit. And it just varies honestly, usually on people's enthusiasm for what that, and then you talked a little bit about that, Margalit, for doing that. So another person asked, would you recommend that the diligence on your investors start at the same time as when the investors start diligence on the company, as against waiting for a term sheet stage?
Yeah, I would start early. I don't think you need to go full out right in the beginning. You don't know who's going to commit, who's not. You don't want to put a lot of time necessarily if somebody's just going to give you a no at the end. But by the time you get a term sheet, you're not going to have time necessarily to do all that diligence. It depends on the VC and the fund. Some people will give you a lot of time to contemplate that term sheet. Others won't. Some people might give you a time, like give us an answer on our term sheet in X weeks, or we're going to move on. And so you don't want to wait until you get that term sheet. You want to start early. And I think you can sort of gauge level of interest based on how many interactions you're having with that fund, to essentially to kind of get a sense of how much work you should be putting into diligencing that investor as well. And again, take advantage of every conversation you have with them and ask a lot of questions. They should be open books, hopefully.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lot of that's just about using your time wisely, right?
Yes, that's a very good way to put it. Use your time wisely.
Yeah. So we have another question, and this one I don't know. So I'm hoping you might have a little insight, and if not, we'll hopefully go back to some other folks who would. It says, if you are at an early stage where the founding scientists will be needed to do a lot of work on the science and in writing SBIRs, STTRs, making presentations to investors, et cetera, what kind of vesting strategy is typically done for the CEO to get them up to the 40 to 50% mark? How much upfront, and then do they typically gain percents per year, or based on milestones such as bringing in certain amounts of investment? I mean, I know a little bit about that, but I know what I traditionally have seen, but it's a really good point here about what the person actually does versus time-based.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have specifics. I really think it's company dependent, but yeah, I mean, it really depends on the company. I feel like so many companies, like, yes, there are sometimes you're going to need SBIRs and STTRs, and that should be worked out between the founding scientist, or if there's going to be like an external lab setup, and so, and other times we hire CROs, and so maybe not necessarily all that work's done in there. Yeah.
I wonder if this one too, if we could come back to, so the person who asked this, Linda, if you can send us the chat afterwards, and perhaps we can follow up with this person, because I'd like to dig into this a little bit more, because I do think that, I mean, this is somewhat specific, but I'm just not sure on the answers.
Can I comment on that as well, Kirsten?
Yeah,
of course. So we have seen situations, as you all know, with the university startups that the team, sometimes they do not work out, right? So your founding CEO, and later on how you treat that, their shares, and they found a new CEO, then there are a lot of and a lot of tension in these discussions, and sometimes real problem in getting the company having a new CEOs there. So I would say in this question from Alex, and yeah, we have seen approaches to have them have a vesting schedule for that. So you do recognize your initial founding CEO's contribution, up to what stage, is there any milestone there? there. And if it does not work out, give the company opportunity to have new CEOs. And we did see examples of that, especially in those very nasty situation when things does not work out, gave the company a new chance of regrouping and moving forward. And I think that's actually some of the things that people should be considering. If especially, the founders, normally their situation, each other, you want to do it together, for a long time. In other situations, especially if the CEO you just brought in and you need to test them out. And I think that sort of a schedule will be very important, and the law firm certainly can guide you through like what type of schedule is appropriate for each different situation, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. They can definitely help you. And so I've actually seen a mix sometimes of time-based versus reward. We talked earlier about that sometimes there's reward at the end of the year for particularly doing well. Perhaps you went above expectations or beyond, what was kind of your goals for the year, et cetera. So I think that it's just can be a mix, but you do need to think about it. You have to make sure the person has actually met the expectations in order for them to receive perhaps that full investment of the year. So we have another question, but actually I think it's going to be answered in some of our later slides, which has to do with the qualities that investors look for in people. So I'm going to hold off on that question right now, Keshav. So just wait for us. And if we don't answer it, we will come back to it. So, all right, we're going to go into ownership because we haven't even gotten to sorry, Alistair, did you want to say something else?
I just wanted to view equity as a scarce resource and be very thoughtful about how you're allocating it and when. I feel like you go in with that strategy and that should help going forward. You don't want to just give a bunch of equity right in the beginning if somebody hasn't proven themselves.
So we're going to run through now an ownership, a cap table basically, and a waterfall and how that works actually with this equity, so that you can just see a little bit more about how this works when you bring in investors themselves. So sorry, Margalit, I was just kind of taking over there.
Oh, no worries. So I'm going to go through these terms and just define them so that, because we're going to use these when we go through our example later on, and they're also just good terms to know. So the pre-money is typically the current value of your company. So what we typically refer to as the valuation. I like to think about it as, what would someone pay for this company or tech right now at its given stage? It's usually based on comps, could be based a little bit on revenue as well if it's tech and not life science. And this gets defined as the share price by the number of shares issued. The post-money is the pre-money plus the amount of capital invested. So the pre-money share price carries over to that invested capital, and it is going to be used to define the amount of equity being purchased during that financing as well and the fundraise. The post essentially becomes the new value of the company after that investment. Fully diluted is important because it refers to the fact that the pre or post is taking into account all the shares that have been issued, so including warrants and options. You always want to make sure you know what the fully diluted value is if it doesn't specifically say that in the term sheet. Preferred stock is typically what's given to investors like an A or a B round or C seed round, because we're taking on additional risk at that stage. And so we want something what's called a preferred stock. Preferred stockholder has a higher claim to distributions than a common stockholder. They have a higher claim to company assets. They get paid out first during liquidity events, depending on the type of preferred stock and so on. And then a common stock is what a founder or employee typically has and what gets distributed at the initial equity split. Go to the next slide. So here we go into some terms to look out for with regards to liquidation preferences. Essentially, these terms are defining the provisions around the shares that the investors are purchasing, and the type of shares and number of shares will define who gets paid first and how much. So when an investor asks for a 1x participating preferred share, they are guaranteeing that when the company liquidates, they will get 1x the capital they invested back before anyone else gets paid out. Once the participating preferred investors get their investment amount back, the residual of that exit or liquidity event is split amongst the shareholders proportional to what percentage they own. So investors get paid back first, and then the remainder gets split. A cap is a way for the common shareholders to reduce their dilution. It sets a predetermined payout for that investor that has that participating preferred share. So they can choose to either get a certain multiple of their investment back, or they can choose to treat their shares as if they are non-participating and receive their percent ownership of the exit. And then a non-participating preferred means there's no initial payout of the investment amount. They receive their payout based on their percent ownership of the company. They still have preferred shares, so they still have a higher claim to other distributions like dividends, but they're not getting that necessarily that participating part. And the 1x can be 2x. Typically in life science right now, for early stage companies, we're seeing 1x participating preferred a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to run through, thanks Margalit. We're going to run through an example of this just to show you how this works. This is highly simplified. So for those of you who have worked on cap tables before, yeah, this is very simple, but it'll just give you an idea of how this works on the numbers as things flow through. So we start off with this founding structure again that we talked about before. We're just going to make it, again, we're making it simple, 40, 40, 20 in this particular case. There is a seed investor who comes in and is going to invest $5 million in the company. The company and the seed investor have agreed on a pre-money valuation of the company to be $10 million. So the post-money of that round is $15 million. It's the 5 plus the 10, 15 million. And since the initial value of the company, the pre-money valuation was $10 million and the post-money is 15 million, that's a 33% dilution of the company. Very simple math here, right? And this seed investor gets a preferred 1x. So basically, when an exit happens, potentially they would get paid out first unless they convert to common. And we'll talk about that later. But so they're going to get their money first on a payout. All right, then they raise, so this particular company goes and raises again a Series A. They've had some further developments with the company. People are valuing it higher now. So the pre-money, the company now they feel is worth $45 million before the investment of this particular round. So in this round, in the Series A, they're raising 15 million from perhaps the same investor, perhaps some different investors. And so the pre-money valuation was 45 million. Again, this is something that they've agreed upon. So 15 plus 45 is 60. That's the post-money valuation. 45 over 60 means a 25% dilution on the round. And these investors, the Series A investors, are receiving participating preferred, which Margalit mentioned before. Basically, they will potentially get their money out first, but then they also participate in the common shares that are divided up after that as well. Okay. So now we're going to run through what this means as far as exits. So you can see down here what we've been doing is actually this diluting everyone down. So now because between the two rounds, it's been dilution. The investors have basically bought 50%, half of this particular company through these different rounds. So let's run through an up case, a case where the company actually is acquired for 250 million. So, hey, across their rounds, they raised 20 million, but they got acquired for 250 million. This is a success. I don't think that anyone can doubt. This is a success if you only raised $20 million. And so in this case, the investors and all of the people who received that founding equity structure plus whatever happened, we're not including option pool, the increases in the option pools here. Just go with it. We know this isn't exactly how it would be going, but we're just trying to show you exactly how this would play out money-wise. In this case, with the 250 million acquisition, both of the investors who invested in these particular rounds are going to convert to common because their equity is worth more as common than preferred. And so their 50% ownership, they would be receiving 250 million, $125 million. And then the 10%, the option pool people would get 25 million, co-founders 50, and the lead founder and CEO 50. So basically, this is a really simple example because it was an up case. Everyone's going to say, hey, my common shares are worth the most, rather than me first receiving back my investment, which would bring that down, et cetera. So we're all going to take this nice upside. But this is how it plays out in the case of perhaps not such a great outcome, but still an outcome. Where the startup didn't do as well, but ended up being acquired for $25 million, which is still greater than the total dollars invested. Again, the total dollars invested was the seed and the Series A, the $20 million. So in this particular case, how it is going to work is that we have $25 million to split up the pie, right? In this case, both the seed and the Series A investors are going to receive their money back first. We talked about that. That's what a preferred means, because if they converted just to common, they would receive less than the amount that they received, that they invested in the company. So the seed money, the seed investor had just had preferred, so they're going to get their money back. The Series A's investor or investors had participating preferred, meaning they're going to get that $15 million back, but they're also going to participate on the common shares that are the amount that's left for the common shares. And so they're receiving that $15 million back, plus basically 1.7 million based on their ownership in the company at that time. So that $5 million that's left above the 20 million for the investors is split up between the Series A investor, then the option pool, the co-founders, and the lead founder. Now, there are also cases, and we didn't run through this in this, where the company is acquired for less than was invested. And in those cases, typically the investors are paid back. There may be some sort of incentivization provided to certain employees in the company so that things continue on with the work that has been done so far as part of the acquisition. The acquirer may want that. So there may be sort of further incentivizations that are provided. But again, the investors themselves are usually going to be paid back at least a portion of their money based on that acquisition, even if it is below what was put into the company. Margalit, is there anything you wanted to say on that?
Nope, covered it.
No?
No.
Okay. And I think we have a few questions that have come in. I haven't looked at them yet. So maybe you can look at those while I go over the key takeaways of equity ownership. So we've talked about this many times now. Dilution is a really important part that's going to happen if you're taking money from investors like angels, like VCs, et cetera. Dilution is going to be a part of your reality, and there's going to be dilution round per round, and that dilution is going to be based on the valuation of the company and the amount that's being raised of the company. We went through those really simple examples on that. Always be paying attention to the liquidation preferences of your investors. Honestly, once the liquidation preferences move up to a higher and higher preference, it's hard to ever go back from that liquidation preference in your future rounds. And we already talked about participating and non-participating preferred. Strange terms, once they appear, that's what I was just alluding to, will rarely ever disappear. So once you start having terms in there, your future investors are always going to ask for that, or they're going to ask for something above that. So like, as we said, 1x participating preferred is very common. When you starting getting into things like 2x participating preferred, et cetera, just really be careful that it's appropriate for your company and appropriate for the investment round that you're raising and for the other investors associated with this. And we talked about investors are going to get paid out first. They're putting in this money. Most investors are investing because they have raised money based on a certain thesis they have, and those investors who've invested in them, so they're limited partners, are investing them usually for returns. And so that's why they're making these investments. They have a certain thesis that they believe in and their investors believe in, and they're hoping that they can make money then to go back to their investors and then hopefully raise future venture funds. So Margalit, we have some questions that I have not seen yet.
Yeah. So I'll start from the bottom. I'll go back up. So what is the zone of indifference? So that results from a cap. So when you put a cap into the term sheet, it could be very valuable for the common shareholders to prevent the dilution that would come from investors having this 1x participating preferred without a cap. But it also creates what's called the zone of indifference, where there's a range of exit prices where the investors would get the same amount of money at the exit, whether they went with the capped amount or whether they switched into the common and got the percent ownership. And so within that range, your investor is not going to be incentivized essentially to help you get a better exit, because for them, it doesn't matter. And so that's why we call it the zone of indifference. And as you can imagine, if those investors are on your board and they're helping make decisions, they're not going to care about whether if you had let's say like a $50 million exit acquisition opportunity on the table, but the zone of indifference went up to 75 million for them, like where they would get the same amount. They don't want you to hold out until 75 million, like a $75 million price comes through. They don't necessarily, they're just not going to be motivated to help you get that better exit for a range of prices based on whatever that cap is. And then so above that, and then I'll come back down to the question. Okay. So the university equity position is not reflected, wasn't reflected in that.
Right.
So what stage capital is usually anti-dilutions in place for the, to what stage / capital is usually anti-dilutions in place for the university? Yeah.
Yeah. And so often with universities, and I don't know what Cornell's practice in particular is, but often they're looking for anti-dilution through perhaps the first real funding round of the company. So it may be through a Series A, or there may be a certain amount that they're asking for. But this is pretty common now with universities. I think I see most universities having some sort of anti-dilution provision. The counter to that is the universities could receive a higher equity percentage without anti-dilution. But what I have seen over time, just I've been working in there a long time, is that most companies are more comfortable perhaps having a lower equity percentage, but with an anti-dilution amount associated with that. And often it's going to be through Series A. But these days, those life science Series A can be so large that may not make particular sense. So this is highly dependent on the situation itself. So hopefully that's helpful.
And then how does ownership correlate with board seats / control of the company? So generally, what we see is that the board composition can change from financing round to financing round. It's not necessarily based on your equity allocation. But it can be, and it's related. So essentially, like the lead investor in the round will typically request a board seat, so they sit on your board. As well as some additional investors in the round, depending on how much they're participating in that round. Generally, the CEO will be on the board as well, and a founding scientist can be on the board as well. I've seen that. And then there's usually an independent, and the independent doesn't have equity necessarily. They might have a little bit, but they're in terms of equity allocation and size, they don't have a lot of equity. The whole point is they're independent. Anything else to add to that, Kirsten?
No. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that I think that the one thing I would add is just be careful about your board size. You just don't make it too big. And really it should not, and you always have to, as you know, we have an odd number of board members because you have to vote on things, etc. But you do want to be careful. And there's other boards that could be associated with your company though to address other things. Like there are scientific advisory boards and other boards that may help your company along, that maybe the general board isn't going to be addressing. So.
And the board composition should be in the terms for your fundraising, for your financing. So that is something you could discuss and potentially negotiate on. And then, so we covered the standard for liquidation preference for biotech.
And then the last question that just came in about these examples were for growth scenarios. We actually have a totally separate presentation where we've actually gone through in much more detail on cap tables that does have a real down round example and how that worked out, et cetera. As we're going through this in the chat, I can put a link actually, and I'm not sure, but I can send the link to Alice and Linda for you guys to send it out to you guys later. But we have it's like a 30 to 45 minute video on exactly this. So,
and did we answer the pros and cons of founding scientists, professor to run startups versus focusing on science?
I think what I said was, and I apologize, I direct messaged this person. I think we're going to talk about that in the next series of slides.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe we could address that one in this next series of slides if we don't fully get to it. Does that make sense to you, Margalit?
Yeah, I think we will.
Right.
So
okay, so we have like 27 minutes left, and you all have been wonderful about sticking with us. Okay, so we're gonna move on from equity. We're going to talk about something that obviously we've been talking about quite a bit and is of interest, it seems, to all of you, but it is how to assess a potential CEO for your life science startup. And this also is a presentation we created because we were finding, as we were talking with universities, that sometimes who they thought was a particular terrific CEO, he or she was someone that we weren't willing to invest in. And why was there that potential disconnect in that? So we wanted to create this in part to go through our thinking about these CEOs. And, one thing we will say, ahead of this is that CEOs come in all different flavors. You can't just look at someone and say, oh, they have all this background, they're definitely going to be a CEO. But you're obviously going to start bringing into, as you look at this, your perspectives and your questions. And a lot of this just has to do with questions and asking the right questions about these potential candidates. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through an example with you and talk about how we would think about this process. So we have an example of a company. We're going to do life sciences one this time. We've been doing a lot of tech. We're going to do life sciences now. There's a rosy option. It's a new oncology therapeutics company developing a small molecule against a novel biological target with potential use in treating pancreatic cancer. And so here's some just key facts about that the target was first discovered in a highly regarded lab. The biology around the mechanism of action has been well validated by outside parties. They have animal model results that look promising. The model advanced compound is now at lead optimization stage. And so the company expects to complete IND enabling studies and enter the clinic in 18 months. So these are really important facts to be thinking about. Okay, this is what is going to be happening. So we need people who are going to be able to lead this through this. They're going to raise a Series A of $30 million to get them through this. So that it will fund them through the phase 1 clinical development. And the current team consists of a scientific founder and a medicinal chemistry consultant, and a postdoc in the founder's lab is also planning to join the company. So a pretty advanced stage, in some ways, advanced stage company with very few people associated with it so far. So they are looking for candidates for their CEO, and they have 4 right now. And so we're going to run through each of these candidates, and we're going to have you vote on each of these candidates, which one you would choose just based on this very small amount of information. And we're going to dive into this more, but we want to know who you would choose based on just on this information. So candidate A has 10 years of experience, first as a research scientist at AstraZeneca, and left to become VP product development at a startup that Pfizer acquired for $300 million. Candidate B is a 3-time successful entrepreneur in medical devices and diagnostics. One company went public, one was acquired by Medtronic, and one is still private. Candidate C is a former executive director of Merck's Immuno-Oncology Research Division, and prior to that was CSO of a VC-backed company developing a biologic. And candidate D is the founding PI of the company, spent 2 years as CSO of a previous university spinout that was developing a small molecule therapeutic. So based on this, who would you choose as your pick, this first pick, before we go into further information? And Linda, just let us know when this is done.
They're still voting.
Okay.
Okay, I think we are ready.
Okay. And I can't see the results. So if you can, it should say share results. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So great. So half of you picked candidate B. Terrific. Because this is a person, and I'm gonna, you guys can write in the chat why you picked certain candidates, but I'm gonna guess it's because they're a 3-time successful entrepreneur, which is, yeah, that would resonate with me quite a bit too. Margalit, any thoughts just from seeing this, you know, who you think might be a good candidate?
Yeah, I mean, it's about successes and it's also about expertise, right? And so you want to also look for folks who are thinking along the lines of what this company is going to do and what they might what they might need going forward. And so B is good for success, but C might have good drug development experience. So that might be somebody I would also consider as well.
And so now we're going to go into the process of digging deeper. And so what we're trying to get you with this is we're not, and so again, we're not saying there's a totally right option here, but when you're digging deeper into the candidates about some of the things that you're going to look into for them. So you're going to want to ask about their track record of success. So for this particular candidate, you know, they were at AZ. How did they do at AZ? What did they do? How was that useful in actually developing products at AstraZeneca itself? When they went to the startup company, what does $300 million mean? Acquisition. How much did they actually raise in the first place? You know, if they raised $450 million, not really a success there. If they raised only, you know, 50, definitely a success. And how much did they really have? You know, in this case, I just said, okay, let's just make up a number. It was a moderate success. The company had raised 200 million. So not a terrific success, but, you know, the venture capitalists didn't lose their money. But how critical was this person's role actually at the startup company? Did they report directly to the CEO? How influential was this person on the senior team? And so this case, we ended up talking with people at the previous startup. A was really well liked, really great team member, but not a key decision maker. So then we're also going to look at transitions. We're going to say, okay, why did they leave AstraZeneca in the first place? You know, were they actually doing well, but were recruited to the startup company and you know, AstraZeneca wanted to keep them? Or did they, was there some other reason that they left? We want to understand their domain expertise. Obviously this is a research scientist. How have they kept up on that? Have they continued to really be on top of the area? And I love this because I will say, like a lot of our team members say this all the time, how curious is this person technically? And I know Margalit's laughing, but we try to, when we're talking with folks, we want to understand, what do they really understand the domain, but what have they done to keep up, and what do they do to stay current on that? And given that this person this would be their first time as a CEO, can they be a leader? And often what we're looking for here is, do people follow them? So did people at the startup or people from the startup company, for example, going to join this person at this company? Is the person still in touch with people at AstraZeneca that might be interested in joining the company as well? We do like to see people that have worked well successfully together before work on new endeavors together. And this goes to the next one too. Did A's colleagues follow A from AstraZeneca to the startup company? And we also just looking at their talent. Is there a raw talent there? This is something that they're able to develop? Their intelligence, their force of nature, personality, their compassion, their passion and compassion, and are they a continuous learner? So these are kind of questions that we're digging into, and particularly for A, as we look at kind of their employment history. And so we're doing the same thing on each one of these candidates. So we're just going to kind of tell you more information on, digging deeper what we found out about each one of these candidates. Again, this is made up, but this often happens to us that we're really excited about someone, and then we start digging deeper, and perhaps the layers of the onion tell us more things that we're really glad we found out, but make perhaps our investment more difficult. So this is the candidate that, like, I think about half of you voted for. So here, the 3-time successful entrepreneur, right? 3 of their companies have done well. We want to understand for this person's role actually in that then. So in this particular case, the first company was founded 10 years ago, went public 5 years ago, and trades at $1 billion today. So terrific, has been very successful. The medical device company was acquired by Medtronic for 80 million, but raised 50 million. Okay, that's all right. Perhaps not a resounding success, but it's better than having failed, obviously. And then the private company that they're associated with is still private. It's funded by Orbit and Canaan, and the CEO recruited his or her, we should that replacement after raising venture round because he or she thought the company needed domain expertise. All right, so this is what we were kind of told what was the story, but then we went to dig even further into each one of these, and it turns out that this candidate B was not at the first company at the time of the IPO and left, in quotes, 3 years earlier. The medical device company actually was, the initial upfront payment was $30 million of that 80 million, and 50 of the payout hasn't been actually earned yet, hasn't actually been paid to the company. So actually the investors have not received their money back on that particular company. And then we looked into the company that is still private and talked with the other investors, because one thing you'll learn as you do your startup company is investors all know each other and they all talk to each other. And especially I would say true in the life sciences community, which is even smaller than the tech community. They talk to each other and they learn things from each other. So in this case, B was pushed out by the VCs because B executed poorly and recruited poorly as well. All right, so that's candidate B. Candidate C, let's go on to a little bit more information on them and digging into them. So this is the former executive director at Merck's Immunology Research Division. So someone who's basically been in big pharma, but also was at the CSO of a VC-backed company developing a biologic. So this candidate has a very strong technical knowledge of the development of oncology therapeutics, including bringing them through clinical development. C has been at Merck for 30 years, and Merck's immuno-oncology group had hundreds of people. So that this person had a lot of reports to them, and the person expects a salary of $400,000 a year from the startup post-funding. And I'm just going to have Margalit comment on this really quickly, because this is very different in the tech world than the life science world.
The salary point specifically?
Yeah, the salary point, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really depends on the stage of your startup, but I mean, 400K is a little high, but it's not absurd anymore in the life science startup world at this point.
Yeah.
Obviously, not every startup's going to have the funds to pay somebody that amount at this stage, and that's where like equity allocations come into play, and you could start thinking about that. But it's not a crazy salary, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think on the tech side, they feel like that's probably a bit high sometimes, but it really, again, it just is very dependent on the opportunity. So, and the person associated with it. So that
the person, their experience, how much capital the startup has, and all that.
Right. So, yeah. And as being a founding member of your startup company, you're going to be looking at salaries and what those comps are too. So something else to look into.
But if a startup really doesn't have a lot of capital and a CEO candidate comes to you asking for that salary, that's absurd. After raising capital, it's a different story.
Raising capital, right. This company's looking to raise $30 million. They may be able to afford that. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So then we have candidate D, the founding PEI of the company. This person is highly regarded in their field and has done much of the original work around the novel target. Several members of this person's lab want to follow this person into their company. And then this person has been, part of a previous startup company and was disgruntled when a new CEO was brought in, and that, she is determined to prove now her CEO skills. So based on all of this, we're going to have you vote again. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about some things that we do in looking at each one of these. So, and really what we're trying to do is just to show you, when you peel back the onion, you just may find out things that where someone seems great on paper may not end up being the right CEO for your company. Thank you, Linda, so much for putting up these polls.
Okay, I think I can share now.
Okay, thanks.
I still see some people are voting. So
Okay,
a few seconds.
no worries. Take your time.
Okay, I will stop and I'm sharing now.
Okay. Terrific. Great. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, and some of this, again, this is hard to decide, you know, who really would be, and you would do a lot more digging than this. And we're going to talk about that on the following slides about how you'd be doing more digging, because the CEO is such a critical part of your company. And that's why we're having this conversation, obviously right now, is because it is so important for you to find the right match for your company going forward. So thank you so much, Linda, for doing that. So sorry, Margalit, you want to go into key insights from the candidate review?
Yeah, definitely. So I think you guys got a sense from that selection process. There really is no one candidate that will fit all the needs of the company and is really the perfect match. But what you want to think about is sort of the stage of the company you're creating, what the needs are for that company, and then try to find folks who have that experience or those quality the current stage of the company needs, right? And it's always important to dig a bit deeper when you're looking for a CEO candidate. I'm sure you've all had the experience with your students, postdocs, and research assistants where they, as Kirsten mentioned, they look great on paper on their resume, but they don't they're actually not the right fit for what you need. Past success is important to see, but failure is not necessarily a bad thing either. When you talk to a candidate about past failures, what you want to see is that they acknowledge that failure and that they've learned from it. In science, not everything works, and it's not necessarily an execution mistake that made it fail, right? It's a lot of the time, it's the result of just like the underlying biology not fitting the hypothesis. And in life science startups, that happens all the time as well. So you want to make sure that your CEO candidates understand that too, and can be honest when something isn't working and redirect or pivot. You also want to make sure the person you're looking at has low ego and knows where their domain expertise is and where it is not. Great leaders don't do everything themselves. They surround themselves with great people and listen and encourage those people. And that is the phenotype of the person you want. You want someone who can attract the right people with the right expertise and learn from them. So go to the next slide.
And then I'm going to mention, sorry, one thing really quickly is that, because someone asked, is the ability of the CEO to raise money important? And this goes back to the track record of success. Yes, absolutely. Because not only they're going to have to raise money now, they're going to have to raise money later too, because most companies don't raise one round and are done. Like they are someone who they're going to have to continually be able to raise money every 18 months or something. So, and actually probably even more, but anyway, so you can talk more to that.
Yeah, we highlight that. We have a slide that talks about different stages, and at every stage, a good fundraiser and a good storyteller is important.
Yeah. And another person mentioned about the drive of candidate D, the founding PEI. Like no one's going to have potentially that drive. But the other thing that I'll put on on that part is that, well, so the founding PEI sometimes can be the right person, but I would say the vast majority of the time is not. Running a lab is very different than running a company, and the expertise needed for running a company is very, very different. So there is a lot of domain expertise. There may be a lot of industry expertise too, especially these days with all of the crossover happening between academia and industry. But there just may not be that business expertise that is needed for that. So that's really why we often are looking at that pairing of the scientific founders with that business side. Okay, sorry, going on to the next slide.
Oh, no worries.
Great
questions, guys. Thank you so much. And so when it comes to the characteristics we look for, this is it looks like a long list, but it's actually a pretty short list. But it's and again, they don't need to have every single characteristic. You're not going to find a perfect person all the time, but these are things to look out for. So track record of success, not just good exits, but examples of good execution too. Strong judgment. Do they make good decisions in difficult situations? Are they a continuous learner? They're constantly learning from the science and adjusting based on that. Do they have domain expertise? So if it's a clinical stage therapeutics oncology company, do they have experience in clinical stage? oncology therapeutics and drug development for that, and clinical studies. So a great leader who knows how to build a team and manage that team. You want somebody who has the ability to attract and retain talent. So when you need to hire that CMO, they know where to start looking for the right fit and are someone a good CMO wants to work with. Someone who is entrepreneurial and passionate, like you said, like the drive is really important. Running a startup is hard. It's a 24/7 job, and you need someone who is passionate about entrepreneurship, because commercializing a therapeutic is definitely different than working in a lab and running a lab. Hands-on driver and manager of a team. So when that R&D effort starts to struggle, they can communicate effectively with that team and figure out how to motivate the group to move forward. You want to see clear examples of strong execution. So did they get their IND enabling studies completed in a timely manner at their last startup, or were there CMC concerns they navigated well? You want a good fundraiser, again, really important. You want someone who can tell a good story to investors, get them excited about the company too, right? It's a very different personality trait to have, like, it's almost like a good salesman than somebody who's technically good at the science. And that's a personality trait you want to look for. You want somebody who can be scrappy, especially when you are a brand new startup with very little capital. Someone who has high transparency and their their ethics is key as well. So you want someone who will be honest when things are going sideways and can course correct quickly. The other thing to note is once they start working for you, are they actually delivering on their promises? If they're repeatedly promising one thing and not delivering, don't keep bad management around. It may be time to start looking for a new CEO or new management at that point.
And we have a couple of questions, Margalit, and I do want to get the question. I know we have a couple more. We only have 3 more slides, guys. So we're going to try to get through everything. But one of the questions is, in tech, you saw giant companies being created by first-time entrepreneurs. Nobody knew if they could raise. Why are we still sticking to seasoned CEOs when it comes to life sciences? And I just off the top, I will say, that is not always the case, right? There are definitely some that have that don't necessarily have CEO experience before. They just have some other domain expertise. But Margalit, I'd love for you to comment on this, because I think that is more common than not.
I honestly think the tech CEOs are just like a little braver than the life science CEOs, the life science VCs. The tech VCs are willing to take riskier bets sometimes, and us life science VCs are a little behind the curve and still prefer to see CEOs with past experiences and past success and years of experience. But it's for good reason that we're looking for that. It's hard. It's really hard to run a startup. It's really hard to commercialize these therapeutics, these devices. These regulatory paths are challenging. Drug development is challenging. MedChem is very challenging. Managing, people think you like hire a CRO and they do your experiment for you, but you have to manage the CRO. You don't just hire them and walk away and hope that the data looks good. And so all of those are skills that you could build over time and learn. And so that's why we really like seeing people that have that past experience. And usually what we'll do is, if somebody's like a first time working in a startup, but they have additional past experiences, they just haven't been the CEO, like a COO is a great position, a CSO, and then maybe the next startup that they work on, they could be like the first time CEO, but at least they have that other previous startup experience that they can draw from where they were C-suite.
Those are all really good points. And I think it is just the life sciences, and especially therapeutics, is just such a different industry than tech. So what someone here mentioned, tech CEOs do not face the administrative regulatory rules that biotech does. If you look at the failure of therapeutic startups versus tech startups, the reason the majority of the time the life science startups are failing is because scientific failures. Like, it just is not translating into humans. It is not translating from the bench to the bedside, either from the academic to the startup, or from the startup to the patient, et cetera. There's a lot of that, and so making sure you have the expertise that really can apply to each one of those steps to make sure it's done the right way, and those clinical trial failures don't happen because of errors at the company, but happen actually because of errors of the science. it's complicated. Whereas on the tech side, it's often market failures, other types of aspects. So it is very complicated, but that's a really, really good question. And there's one other question. Can you discuss the major differences of healthcare/pharma sector versus tech sector in terms of startups and entrepreneurship, which is a pretty general question. But that's also, I'm just going to say, that's why we have two teams. We have a life sciences team and a tech team, because the diligence process, et cetera, what we do is different. There is quite a bit of overlap, but there are differences in the expertise that are needed on each one of our teams for how they're looking at opportunities. And Margalit, feel free to comment a little bit on that, because I know we only have a couple minutes and we want to get through the last two slides.
Yeah, no, it's that's the perfect way to explain it. With the way I go about my diligence process has some overlap with the way tech team does, but I can tell you for a fact that the tech team's not looking at rodent experiments and trying to assess the data in comparison to other rodent experiments and so on and so forth. So no, they're definitely very different. And in terms of startups and entrepreneurship, I mean, I still see postdoc and grad students trying to create startups. I was one of those postdocs trying to create a startup in the life science field, but I feel like they're less likely to get a VC to make a bet on them unless they had. I was constantly told that I needed somebody with gray hair on my team.
I'm gonna, Margalit, I'm gonna just show people this particular slide just about the changing CEO requirements. But I think the most important aspect for us to still cover is how we diligence candidates, because I know we just have like 30 seconds left. Sorry, Alice.
Yes.
I'm running long.
Yeah. So yeah, how do we go about diligence for a CEO candidate? And again, like I mentioned, you can use all of these to diligence your investors as well. I always start with Google. You'll most likely come across somebody's LinkedIn and you'll get their full experience as well as their network contacts. So try to find common acquaintances and reach out to them. You can also look through their previous experience and find former colleagues that way. You could talk to other investors as well. We do that. Sometimes the entrepreneurial world is pretty small, especially when folks are fundraising. They're talking to a bunch of us, so then we talk to each other. And you could do that as well for your investors too. When you're talking to other investors, you can ask about different funds you're talking to. We also research their previous companies. Did they have successful exits? Did they fail in the same category in the current venture, or have relevant experience that can cross over? Always call references and use their references to get additional references to get a less biased opinion. Google everyone. Google is your friend. It's important that if you do have concerns, be upfront with the candidate about the concerns, engage their reaction. It can tell you a lot about a person's communication and people skills. It's important also to understand that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and also what's acceptable for the stage of the startup you're at. We're big fans of the pregnant pause at OUP. Ask a question, become comfortable in the silence, give somebody plenty of time to respond, but also gives them the opportunity to take a conversation in a direction that could be very revealing of their personality and style, and do your best to be open-minded and avoid confirmation bias. Okay. Next slide. And I think the last slide is just the summary slide.
Yeah, and I think that we covered most of this, but feel free to reach out to us afterwards and ask us questions. So if you want, Alice, I can stop sharing, and feel free to send. We can send this to Alice. She can send it around to all of you afterwards if you have any. If you want to see the slides.
Okay. Well, that's bring us to the end of the session, and with so many questions people asked, we can see people how interested in this topic, and certainly a conversation many people care about. I want to first on behalf of all of us, thank Kirsten and Margalit to spend time sharing their knowledge and their insight about this, and for such a lively and actively interacted session. And we hope to bring more topics like this to you in the future. At the end of the session, and there are going to be a survey. I hope you fill in that and also suggest the future topics and like this, what do you want to hear? And so we will follow up and provide the information Kirsten and Margaret shared, and organize more topics like this and people cared about. And thank you all, and thanks Kirsten and Margaret again for this. All right.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for being such a great audience. You guys were terrific. Thanks for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's great.
Thank you both.